Welcome to Affair Crimes Uncovered. Enjoy this true crime story. Oak Brook, Illinois, population 3,500, was the kind of town where everyone knew their neighbors. Picket fences lined the streets, and the sound of children's laughter echoed through the parks on warm summer evenings. It was a place where people left their doors unlocked and trusted that their kids were safe playing outside until the streetlights came on. At the heart of this seemingly perfect community stood the Lawson family. John Lawson, a respected local businessman, his wife Margaret, a dedicated elementary school teacher, and their daughter Emily, a bright-eyed teenager with a contagious smile. From the outside, they appeared to be the very picture of small-town American success. John was known for his charitable work in the community. He coached the local Little League team and was always the first to volunteer at church fundraisers. Margaret was beloved by her students and fellow teachers alike. And Emily, she was the girl every parent wished their daughter could be, smart, kind, and always willing to help others. But behind closed doors, a darkness lurked that would shake Oak Brook to its very core. It started small, as these things often do. A neighbor might have noticed Emily's smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. A teacher may have wondered why the once outgoing student had become withdrawn and jumpy. But in a town where everyone minded their own business, these subtle changes went largely unnoticed. Sarah Thompson, Emily's best friend since kindergarten, was the first to sense that something was terribly wrong. The girls had always shared everything, but lately Emily had become secretive and distant. "Em, is everything okay at home?" Sarah asked one day as they walked home from school. Emily's eyes darted nervously before she forced a smile. "Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't it be?" But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her friend was hiding something. The way Emily flinched at loud noises, how she always wore long sleeves even in the heat of summer, the dark circles under her eyes that no amount of makeup could hide. It all added up to a picture Sarah was afraid to see clearly. It was a crisp autumn evening when the carefully constructed facade of the Lawson family began to crumble. Margaret Lawson had been working late, grading papers and preparing for parent-teacher conferences. As she pulled into the driveway, she noticed the living room lights were off, which was unusual. John's car was in the garage, and Emily should have been home from her after-school activities. As Margaret entered the house, a muffled sob from upstairs stopped her in her tracks. Her maternal instincts kicking in, she rushed up the stairs calling out, "Emily, honey, are you okay?" The scene that greeted her, as she pushed open Emily's bedroom door, would haunt her for the rest of her life. There, huddled in the corner, was her daughter, tears streaming down her face, her clothes disheveled, and John, her husband of 20 years, scrambling to buckle his belt. In that moment, Margaret's world shattered. The truth she had subconsciously been avoiding for years came crashing down around her. Her husband, the man she thought she knew, had been abusing their daughter. "How long?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Emily's response, broken and filled with years of pain, was like a knife to Margaret's heart. "Since I was 10, Mom. I'm so sorry. I tried to tell you, but he said you wouldn't believe me." John, his face a mask of rage and fear, lunged towards them. "You don't understand," he snarled. "This is our secret. No one can know." But Margaret had found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She grabbed Emily's hand and ran, not stopping until they were safely in the car and speeding towards the police station. Detective Laura Martinez had seen her fair share of ugly cases in her 15 years on the force, but nothing could have prepared her for the Lawson case. As she sat across from Emily in the interview room, her heart broke for the young girl whose childhood had been stolen. "Emily," Laura said gently, "I know this is hard, but I need you to tell me everything. We're here to help you, and you're very brave for coming forward." Over the next few hours, Emily's story unfolded, a tale of years of systematic abuse, manipulation, and terror. John had started with special hugs and secret games when Emily was just 10 years old. As she grew older, the abuse escalated. "He said it was normal," Emily whispered, her eyes fixed on the table. "That all dads did this with their daughters. I didn't know any better." But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Emily, her voice trembling, revealed that there had been pregnancies, 12 of them over the past 5 years. Each time John had forced her to have an abortion, threatening to hurt her mother if she ever told anyone. As Laura listened, she felt a mixture of horror and determination. This case would require delicate handling, not just because of the sensitive nature of the crimes, but because of John Lawson's standing in the community. She knew that some people would have trouble believing that their beloved coach and philanthropist could be capable of such monstrous acts. News travels fast in small towns, and Oak Brook was no exception. By the next morning, whispers of John Lawson's arrest had spread like wildfire. The initial reaction was one of disbelief and denial. "Not John," people said. "There must be some mistake. He's such a good man." But as more details emerged, the town's shock turned to horror and then to anger. How could this have happened right under their noses? How had they all been so blind? Sarah Thompson, racked with guilt for not realizing the extent of her best friend's suffering, organized a candlelight vigil outside the Lawson home. Hundreds of people attended, holding signs that read, "We believe Emily," and "No more secrets." Meanwhile, at Oak Brook High School, counselors were brought in to help students process the news. Many of Emily's classmates were struggling to reconcile the happy facade they had seen with the terrible reality. "I sat next to her in English," one student said, tears in her eyes. "I never knew. How could I not have known?" As the investigation progressed, the full extent of Emily's ordeal began to come to light. Dr. Amelia Chen, a forensic gynecologist, was brought in to examine Emily and review her medical records. "The physical evidence is consistent with long-term sexual abuse," Dr. Chen reported to Detective Martinez. "There are also clear signs of multiple pregnancies and terminations." The doctor's findings corroborated Emily's story, but they also raised troubling questions. How had these pregnancies and abortions gone unnoticed by other medical professionals? The answer, it turned out, was a combination of John Lawson's careful planning and the trust he had cultivated in the community. John had taken Emily to different clinics each time, always in neighboring towns. He had used his charm and apparent concern for his troubled daughter to deflect suspicion. In a cruel twist, he had even used his reputation as a pillar of the community to his advantage, ensuring that no one looked too closely at the situation. As Detective Martinez dug deeper into the case, she uncovered a disturbing new lead. Phone records showed frequent calls between John Lawson and Dr. Robert Green, a gynecologist in a neighboring town. At first, this didn't seem unusual. After all, John was known for his extensive network of professional contacts. But when Laura interviewed Dr. Green, his nervous demeanor set off alarm bells. After hours of questioning, the truth finally came out. Dr. Green had been performing the abortions, fully aware of the situation. "He threatened to ruin me," Dr. Green sobbed, his professional facade crumbling. "Said he'd tell everyone I'd been writing illegal prescriptions. I didn't know what to do." The revelation of Dr. Green's involvement added another layer of complexity to the case. It wasn't just about one man's heinous crimes anymore. It was about a conspiracy of silence that had allowed the abuse to continue for years. The courthouse was packed on the first day of John Lawson's trial. News vans lined the street, and reporters from across the country had descended on Oak Brook. The small town had become the center of a national conversation about child abuse and the dangers of trusting appearances. As Emily took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. She looked small and vulnerable, but her voice was steady as she began to tell her story. "It started when I was 10, she said, her eyes fixed on a point above the jury's heads. "Dad said it was our special secret that Mom wouldn't understand." Over the next few days, Emily's testimony painted a horrifying picture of years of abuse, manipulation, and terror. She spoke of the pregnancies, the forced abortions, and the constant fear that had been her companion for so long. John Lawson sat stone-faced throughout, showing no emotion as his daughter recounted the ways he had betrayed her trust and stolen her childhood. John Lawson's defense team, led by high-profile attorney James Bradshaw, tried to paint Emily as a troubled teenager with a history of lying. They brought in witnesses, neighbors, teachers, even some of Emily's classmates, who testified about what a loving father John had always appeared to be. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Bradshaw said in his opening statement, "what we have here is a tragic misunderstanding. Mr. Lawson is a devoted father who has been falsely accused by a daughter struggling with mental health issues. But the prosecution, armed with medical evidence and Emily's powerful testimony, fought back hard. They called expert witnesses who explained the psychology of long-term abuse and why victims often stay silent. Dr. Amelia Chen's testimony was particularly damning. She presented clear medical evidence of the multiple pregnancies and abortions, leaving no doubt about the physical trauma Emily had endured. As the trial progressed, Oakbrook found itself divided. While most of the town rallied around Emily and her mother, there was a vocal minority who couldn't bring themselves to believe that John Lawson was capable of such crimes. "I've known John for 20 years, said Bill Henderson, owner of the local hardware store. "There's no way he could do something like this. That girl must be confused or lying." These divisions played out in heated arguments at the local diner, in church meetings, and even at school board meetings. The case had forced the town to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, appearances, and the reality that monsters can hide in plain sight. Sarah Thompson, still feeling guilty about not realizing what her best friend had been going through, became one of Emily's fiercest defenders. She organized support groups for survivors of abuse and worked tirelessly to educate the community about the signs of child abuse. "We can't change what happened to Emily," Sarah said at a town hall meeting, "but we can make sure it never happens to anyone else in our town again." After weeks of testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. As the courtroom fell silent, the foreman stood to deliver the decision. "On the charge of sexual abuse of a minor, we find the defendant, John Lawson, guilty." A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by muffled sobs and whispers. Emily, sitting between her mother and Detective Martinez, closed her eyes as tears of relief streamed down her face. But it wasn't over yet. The judge still had to hand down the sentence. Judge Harriet Simmons, a stern woman with a reputation for fairness, looked down at John Lawson with undisguised disgust. "Mr. Lawson," she began, "you have committed unspeakable crimes against your own child. You have betrayed the trust of your family, your community, and most importantly, the daughter you were supposed to protect. The court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." As John Lawson was led away in handcuffs, Emily turned to her mother and whispered, "It's over. It's finally over." In the days and weeks following the trial, Oakbrook struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The town that had once prided itself on its safety and close-knit community was forced to confront the reality that evil can lurk anywhere, even in the most unexpected places. Emily and Margaret Lawson decided to move away, seeking a fresh start in a place where they weren't known as victims. Before they left, Emily spoke at a community meeting, her voice strong despite the pain she had endured. "What happened to me was terrible," she said, "but I don't want it to define me or this town. I hope that by speaking out, I can help other victims find their voice. No one should have to suffer in silence like I did." The case had far-reaching consequences beyond Oakbrook. It sparked a national conversation about child abuse, the importance of believing victims, and the danger of assuming that respected community figures are above suspicion. In response to the case, Illinois lawmakers passed Emily's Law, which strengthened reporting requirements for suspected child abuse and increased penalties for those who failed to report. 5 years after the trial, Emily Lawson, now using her mother's maiden name, was thriving in college. She had become an advocate for abuse survivors, speaking at conferences and working with organizations that helped victims of childhood sexual abuse. "For a long time, I thought my life was over," Emily said in an interview. "But I've learned that while I can't change my past, I can use my experience to help others and to make sure that other children don't have to go through what I did." Back in Oakbrook, the town had changed. The experience had shaken them out of their complacency, but it had also brought them closer together. They had learned the hard way that turning a blind eye was not an option. Sarah Thompson, now a social worker, had started a program in local schools to teach children about body safety and the importance of speaking up if someone was hurting them. "We can't change what happened to Emily," Sarah said, "but we can make sure her story helps protect other children." The Lawson case had sent ripples far beyond the borders of Oakbrook. In the years following the trial, similar cases in other small towns across America came to light. It seemed that Emily's bravery in speaking out had given others the courage to come forward with their own stories of abuse. Detective Laura Martinez, who had been instrumental in bringing John Lawson to justice, found herself in demand as a speaker and consultant. She traveled the country, training other law enforcement officers on how to recognize and investigate cases of long-term child abuse. The Lawson case taught us that we can't take anything at face value, Martinez said during one of her seminars. It's our job to look deeper, to listen to victims, and to follow the evidence, no matter where it leads. Dr. Amelia Chen, the forensic gynecologist whose testimony had been crucial in convicting John Lawson, also became an advocate for change in the medical community. She pushed for better training for doctors and nurses in recognizing signs of abuse, especially in cases where a parent or guardian might be the perpetrator. "We failed Emily Lawson for years," Dr. Chen said in a medical conference. "We can't let that happen to another child. As medical professionals, we have a responsibility to be vigilant and to speak up when we suspect abuse." As the dust settled on the Lawson case, investigators continued to dig into the network that had allowed John Lawson's crimes to go undetected for so long. Dr. Robert Green, the gynecologist who had performed the illegal abortions, became a key witness in a larger investigation into medical malpractice in child abuse cover-ups. Green's testimony led to the arrests of several other doctors and clinic staff who had turned a blind eye to suspicious cases. It also exposed a network of wealthy and influential individuals who had used their power to hide various crimes, including child abuse. "It was like pulling on a thread and watching an entire sweater unravel," said FBI agent Karen Wu, who led the expanded investigation. What started with one case in a small town ended up exposing a web of corruption that spanned several states. The revelation sent shockwaves through medical and legal communities across the country. It prompted a nationwide audit of medical practices and a re-evaluation of how cases involving minors were handled. While the legal and social ramifications of her case continued to unfold, Emily Lawson was on a journey of her own. College had been a fresh start, a chance to reinvent herself away from the shadow of her past. But the healing process was far from easy. There were nights when the memories would come flooding back, overwhelming her with a sense of helplessness and fear. But Emily was determined not to let her past define her. She sought therapy, joined support groups, and slowly began to rebuild her sense of self-worth. Emily's studies in psychology and social work were driven by a desire to understand her own trauma and to help others who had suffered similar fates. She became an advocate for abuse survivors, speaking at conferences and working with organizations dedicated to protecting children from abuse. "For a long time, I thought my life was over," Emily said in an interview. "But I've learned that while I can't change my past, I can use my experience to help others and to make sure that other children don't have to go through what I did." The Lawson case had sent ripples far beyond the borders of Oak Brook. In the years following the trial, similar cases in other small towns across America came to light. It seemed that Emily's bravery in speaking out had given others the courage to come forward with their own stories of abuse. Detective Laura Martinez, who had been instrumental in bringing John Lawson to justice, found herself in demand as a speaker and consultant. She traveled the country, training other law enforcement officers on how to recognize and investigate cases of long-term child abuse. "The Lawson case taught us that we can't take anything at face value," Martinez said during one of her seminars. "It's our job to look deeper, to listen to victims, and to follow the evidence, no matter where it leads." Dr. Amelia Chen, the forensic gynecologist whose testimony had been crucial in convicting John Lawson, also became an advocate for change in the medical community. She pushed for better training for doctors and nurses in recognizing signs of abuse, especially in cases where a parent or guardian might be the perpetrator. "We failed Emily Lawson for years," Dr. Chen said in a medical conference. "We can't let that happen to another child. As medical professionals, we have a responsibility to be vigilant and to speak up when we suspect abuse." As the dust settled on the Lawson case, investigators continued to dig into the network that had allowed John Lawson's crimes to go undetected for so long. Dr. Robert Green, the gynecologist who had performed the illegal abortions, became a key witness in a larger investigation into medical malpractice and child abuse cover-ups. Green's testimony led to the arrests of several other doctors and clinic staff who had turned a blind eye to suspicious cases. It also exposed a network of wealthy and influential individuals who had used their power to hide various crimes, including child abuse. It was like pulling on a thread and watching an entire sweater unravel, said FBI agent Karen Wu, who led the expanded investigation. What started with one case in a small town ended up exposing a web of corruption that spanned several states. The revelations sent shockwaves through medical and legal communities across the country. It prompted a nationwide audit of medical practices and a reevaluation of how cases involving minors were handled. Back in Oakbrook, the town was slowly rebuilding. The experience had shaken them out of their complacency, but it had also brought them closer together. They had learned the hard way that turning a blind eye was not an option. Sarah Thompson, now a social worker, had started a program in local schools to teach children about body safety and the importance of speaking up if someone was hurting them. "We can't change what happened to Emily," Sarah said, "but we can make sure her story helps protect other children." The town also established a community center named in Emily's honor, providing resources and support for families and children. It became a place where people could come together to learn, heal, and grow stronger as a community. Years later, Emily Lawson stood on the stage at a national conference on child abuse prevention. She had come a long way from the frightened girl who had first walked into Detective Martinez's office. Now she was a confident young woman, a beacon of hope and resilience for survivors everywhere. "Every child deserves to feel safe and loved," Emily said, her voice steady and clear. "We must all take responsibility for protecting the most vulnerable among us. My story is just one of many, but together, we can make a difference." As the audience rose to their feet in applause, Emily felt a sense of peace. She had turned her pain into purpose, her suffering into strength, and in doing so, she had created a legacy that would continue to inspire and protect for generations to come. The town of Oakbrook, once shattered by secrets and betrayal, had found a way to heal. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, more united, and more determined than ever to protect their children and ensure that such horrors would never happen again.